all here presumably because we care about culture. And I was telling Dome before we started a little bit ago that I'd really like the next hour to be very practical and how to, because I don't think that I need to have a theoretical discussion to convince you that culture is important. I think by the fact that you're here tells us that you buy into that. And so I think from a practical perspective, we're going to actually, I do want to have a lot of interaction, but as you know, on Zoom, it can be tricky to try to, you know, say something and then you talk over people. So Andrew and I, fortunately, have taken this on the road before. We've facilitated some peer groups, and so he's going to be my co-facilitator. So we're going to do it the old-fashioned way. If you have a comment or a question at any point when I'm talking, raise your hand, and if I don't see you, Andrew will. And for those of you who aren't on video, we'll use the chat feature as well. And I will let you know I've got several points throughout the quote unquote presentation or discussion we're going to have where I'm going to ask for folks to weigh in. So having said that, you know, I think 2020 and I guess it's now looking like 2021 are years of running a business that are different than anything that any of us have been through. And one of the things I've been hearing from a lot of my clients and colleagues is how the extra pressure it's putting on our cultures. And it's interesting because I think, you know, some organizations have sort of risen to the occasion. And it's funny, I have a client where for years the employees were bugging the business owner, let us work from home, let us work from home. And he's like, no, we're not going to do that. Well, you know, it's a service business. They've made the transition seamlessly and it's had a lot of positive impacts for their culture. But by and large, I would say for most organizations, the extra stress that we're all under right now tends to bring out what was broken before in your culture that just might not have been as obvious. So I want to ask a question. This is just going to be a visual. I'm going to first of all ask you to raise your hand if you feel like the culture in your organization throughout the pandemic and the resulting pressures has gotten, I'm going to ask you three different, if you think it's gotten better, if you think it's gotten worse, or if you think it's been a mix. Okay, so first, who thinks their culture has gotten worse as a result of? Okay, all right, hands down. Anybody feel like their culture's gotten better? Okay, and then the third, how many folks think it's been a mix? Some good things have happened, some bad. Okay, good. All right, so good. So I am going to ask later for volunteers to share some specifics around that. So be thinking about maybe some things that you've observed in your culture that you might like to share. You know, the interesting thing is, and I'm going to share a PowerPoint, and I was telling Doan, I have a setting that will hopefully enable you to see the PowerPoint without it dominating your screen so that you can hopefully still see everybody's faces. Okay, so let me see if I can pull you guys back bigger. I'm like Doan, I've got multiple monitors here, so I'm going to try to see everybody's faces as much as possible. Okay, so Andrew, are we seeing the share okay?
Yep, we are good.
Okay, super. All right, so, you know, if you think about it, any group of people that come together have a culture. So even for, you know, those of you involved in the John Carroll Entrepreneurs Association, you have a culture. In your families, you have a culture. And one of the things that's really fundamental about this and important to remember is that whether or not you're purposefully creating your culture or not, it's there. And I like this idea of what gets rewarded gets repeated, because there's sort of this idea. I think oftentimes as business owners, we think, well, people know what my intentions are. They know, what we value here and what's important. And, the culture is, something I've worked hard to establish. But the tricky thing is if culture is not something that you're systematically reinforcing in your culture, what tends to happen is it really gets created or dominated by the most dominant people in your organization, whether because of their positional power or just sort of the kind of domineering type person that they are. And it's interesting, you mentioned in the introduction, Andrew, I facilitate the WPO, which is a peer group for women entrepreneurs, and Kathy Tapman is in that group. And one of the things that we report out each month is, what are we tolerating? I would recommend that as something for you to think about, reflecting on as we talk about what cultures you're trying to reinforce today, because oftentimes the things that we're tolerating give us real hints and clues to the culture and maybe what's not going well. So obviously that wouldn't be something we're going to reinforce, but it's something that we want to figure out how to improve upon. Okay, so, a classic example of this, what gets rewarded gets repeated, would be, and this I see in a lot of organizations, putting out fires. Yay, you put out a fire, right? There's all this chaos, you put out the fire, and that gets rewarded. And everybody knows, when you're putting out fires and when you're in the chaos, you get that rush of adrenaline, right? I mean, it feels good to be that problem solver. But if that happens at the expense of longer strategic term things getting done, or if it gets in the way of effective communication, if you put the fire out but you're rude to your team members, it's that fire got put out, but at what cost? Another example, and this was what we talked about earlier, if all the meetings in your organization start late, what message ultimately is that sending to the people in the organization? And especially the one that really, kind of sets the tone is when that leader is the one who's typically late, right? Because the folks are sitting there thinking, well, gosh, I guess my time's not important. So I had a manager early in my career, and she would inevitably do that. You'd be having a one-on-one, and she just was really bad at managing her time. And so she'd go over, and you'd think, well, when you're the person she's going over with, you felt pretty special, but the person who was waiting to get in the door, feels like, oh, I guess you don't respect my time. Okay, so we want to think about what in your organizations is getting rewarded. And that's going to help, again, the whole thing of culture is, so much of culture is not defined or not stated anywhere. And that is the part of culture, the culture discussion, that's a little bit esoteric, right? Like, what is your culture? It's kind of how you describe it. It's a feeling thing for sure. Okay. So whether I am clear or confused, I always take a group of people with me. So as the leader, let me ask you guys a question. If I asked, let's say I picked 3 people in your organizations, and I pulled them aside and said, hey, what would you say have been the top 3 priorities for Rob or for Bob or for Jackie in 2020? How many of them do you think would be able to just rattle that off right away? It's a good thing for you to try yourself in your organization. What have our 3 big priorities for this year been? Now, this year is a wacky year, so maybe this year is a tough one. And you know what? I need to adjust my screen so I can see the chat. Okay. Okay. So one of the things as we start talking about culture and how to create a system that that makes it a part of the day-to-day and gets reinforced is to remember, and as entrepreneurs, this is something that we struggle with. We need to tell people something 7 times before it really sinks in. Now, so have you guys heard that number 7 times? Because, you'll, as a business owner, I hear business owners say, well, I've shared that with the team. I did my presentation. We've got a plan. We talked about our values. I don't understand why it's not a part of our culture. And it's not only about saying it 7 times, but then obviously reinforcing it on a regular basis. Okay, so I, at this point, would really like to hear from folks who would like to share with the rest of the group what you've seen happening in your organization relative to your culture, and really either positive or negative. And then what we'd especially like to hear is if you have any thoughts on why you've experienced that in your culture. And so if you're willing to share, if you raise your hand and unmute yourself, and then we'll.
Jeannie, this is Sanjay. I can go first if you like.
That'd be great. Thank you.
I'm at a company called Mace Security International. We make mace pepper spray. And one of the things that we did recently is dial in the culture code of the company. We worked with the team to dial that in on what those behaviors look like. What are the values we stand for? And then we also really clarified our mission statement, being in the current sort of environment of social unrest, and and how people perceive, how our employees perceive what we do as a company. Do we sell purely a consumer product manufacturer, or are we trying to do something different with our company? And what I found is that that's been very helpful for the folks to really first of all, have a say in it, as well as sort of us living it. So, for example, we make donations to, we made a donation to a women's shelter, the LGBT Center in Gordon Square, and several other places, mostly because we feel that our mission is to empower the vulnerable, and we're now living it. So those are 2 things that I wanted to share that we've done recently.
Great, thank you.
So I'm at John Carroll University, and so I think that we've struggled recently with culture, and people have become a little paranoid and concerned about state of affairs and financial situations and lots of other things. And I think, higher ed in general, and at John Carroll, I think too, part of what's going on and what's leading some of the issues of culture has to do with communication and transparency. And I think there's a lack of transparency in the industry as a whole. And I think at John Carroll, to some respect, that helps, in our world, administration, faculty, staff, all the different sort of levels of employees kind of understand each other's situation, right? So there's sort of this lack of understanding and empathy, and for others, generally speaking, I think that's sort of damaged part of the culture.
And would you say, presumably everything's being done virtually from a communication perspective?
Yep.
But it sounds like for you, it's more content, not the delivery method. Yeah.
And it's just, again, it's really, it's over communicating, being transparent, not sort of allowing the rumor mills and all the sort of back channel stuff to start. I think would significantly help culture in times like these, when things are stressful and people are worried about themselves and their own piece of the pie, so to speak.
Right, right. Anyone else want to share?
Sure, I can, Jeannie. Coming from a small PR marketing firm that works with manufacturers, our culture really had to become a blend of empathy for all of our clients. That really has been the main culture with respect to the fact that whether they were essential or not, how they marketed and how they went and done business has completely changed. Where many are not allowing people in factories, many of their sales organizations aren't allowed to see their customers. So we first start with empathy, but very quickly our culture changed to what are the tools and training and services that we can offer that would model the empathy and help them, on their day-to-day quests. So kind of a culture empathy blend there.
Right. Well, so we'll continue on that theme because I'd like to hear from folks as we go through and talk more about the how-to relative to this, because I've heard that from others, Rob, and it's this, as a business owner, we're always trying to talk about accountability and holding people accountable for results. But there's a lot of people that are really struggling, emotionally. And so how you walk that fine line as the business owner between maintaining that culture of accountability and then, being empathetic. I know I've heard from business owners too, with this time of year, the days are getting shorter. It's kind of a downer for most of us anyway, when it's dark at 5 o'clock. Okay, so tell me with a show of hands if you've seen this quote before. Okay, now tell me, raise your hand if you agree with it. Okay, so so this is one of those quotes that now fortunately for me in my business, I focus on both strategy and culture. But people like to see, if I talk about helping companies create their strategic plan. Well, Jeannie, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's kind of a witty thing to toss out there for people who maybe aren't as dedicated to the planning process, right? So the fact of the matter is it's not an and or, it's both. And so what I want to talk about today is, in Sanjay, it sounds like you're ahead of the curve in terms of really looking at creating a culture on purpose and how that really flows and is a part of that larger strategy in your organization. So that's not to say that you can't approach creating a deliberate strategy for your organization as a one-off, right? Like, okay, Jeannie, I know it's the fourth quarter. We should be doing our plan for 2021. Things are too chaotic. I just want to do this one-off and create a strategy for my culture. It's not like you can't do that. It's not like that would be entirely wrong. But ideally, kind of like Sanjay said, it's really kind of starts at that higher level and then cascades into specific tactics and strategies around your culture. And it comes from that higher level purpose. And so I want to start by framing this culture conversation and how you do it and how you approach it by looking at it in the context of your larger strategy. Okay, now the good news about this is I've been working with a couple of my clients. It's interesting too. I'm finding companies are starting to do in-person meetings, especially the manufacturing companies. But so I've recently facilitated some off-site planning sessions. And, typically when we're looking at that long-term, where we're taking the organization, we're looking at 3 to 5 years out. And one of the things that's kind of refreshing about having that conversation is, I think we all see that 3 to 5 years out will be hopefully, God willing, through the worst of the pandemic and, at least hopefully meeting with folks in person again, as an example. And what I'm finding a lot of companies looking at is really a shorter planning horizon for the more tactical stuff. You know, we're really looking at first quarter 2021. But if you think about, if you want to roll out a plan for creating a deliberate culture in your organization, and one of the things to think about, and I'm sure you've all experienced this, is the cynicism that can come from folks sort of experiencing the program of the day, right? And so that's one of the reasons why I think it's important when you can to approach the topic of culture in the context of your higher level strategic plan or your strategy. Well, probably the main takeaway from this particular visual is, and again, I think you all know that, that's why you're having this discussion today, is that the best strategy will not be successful if it's not being implemented within the right culture. And this really gets to the idea of, for every business, even if they make widgets, it really is the people. That's the greatest asset of the organization. And so being able to leverage the strengths of the people and get the best performance that you can, which is, you know, that was the title for today's program, is how culture drives performance. And so it really is critical to be able to have that foundation in order for you to accomplish what you're trying to do in your organization. Okay, so this is not meant to be a rhetorical question, because something tells me I've got a room full of planners here, right? So I'd like to hear from you guys in the chat feature, and I mean this seriously, okay? And let me ask this with a show of hands. How many of you have already done some organizational planning for 2021 with your team? Raise your hand if you have. Okay. That doesn't surprise me. So why do we plan? Why? I mean, what's the point? If you could put your thoughts in chat. I see people typing. Okay, so to have direction for your team, establish a vision, set metrics, measure against progress, clear goals, attempt to avoid chaos, right, Kathy? Planning budgets. Okay, uncovering new opportunities, preparing for apparent scenarios, right? Scenario planning is great. Optimize alignment and velocity, clarity of thought on actions to be implemented, gives the team specific directions. Yep, that's so they can see it, bringing it to life. Business, okay, planning for various business variables. That's, again, kind of like the scenario planning. Getting benchmarks. Well, then that's how you know if you're doing well. It's the process as much as the plan. Interesting, that's a great point, right? Getting people together and talking. Need to know what good, oh, you guys are really good at this. Set expectations, define success, remove obstacles, absolutely, capacity allocation. Do you know the #1 desire of employees is to feel in on things? There was a study that was done trying to understand what was most important to them. Was it, you know, their pay, their time off, you know, their title? And the #1 thing they wanted was to feel involved and a part of things. So yeah, I think that point is really valid. Okay, so I'm gonna suggest something even a level above, I think, the things that we've been talking about. And that is to say that the primary reason we plan is to change behaviors. So think about that for a moment. For each of us in our businesses, we're getting a certain result now, and we presumably want a different, better result. And it's that classic definition of, if you know, the definition of insanity, to keep doing things the same way and expect a different outcome. So think about that. So if your goal is growing revenue, growing profitability, expanding geographically, why isn't that happening now? So something needs to change. And so this idea of how you create your culture and how you create your strategic plan are the same. What we want to identify is what behaviors you want to change and what behaviors you want to reinforce. That's not to say in every case it's about change. Sometimes it's about reinforcing behaviors, the good behaviors that are happening now. Okay, so what I'm going to take you guys through is a planning process that you can use not only to create your culture on purpose, you can also use this from an overall strategic or business planning process. And the whole point, this is obviously my process, CG1, is the idea of a team coming together, moving in one direction, having one shared vision, and being able to implement one cohesive and implementable plan, right? So it's just taking something complex and being able to communicate it in a simple way. And having, and I think somebody mentioned this earlier, alignment and unity, which is the key towards really establishing a culture and having it stick, if you will. Okay, so let's think about this logically. If you're saying, I want to be more purposeful about the culture that we have in our organization, there's really 3 steps, okay? So, and I'm gonna go through each of these relative to the culture question. But the first is getting clarity. And again, this is to the point that was made about still having your planning session even when you know stuff is gonna change, because you need to bring everybody together and say, okay, you know, what is happening here? What do we want this to look like? Why isn't it happening now? And having that conversation. It's interesting because I think as business owners, again, oftentimes we think it's almost like people can read our minds, right? Well, obviously we're doing this, and people don't know that. So getting clarity, and that's kind of that, you know, getting the clouds to part and getting clear about that. And then the second is, once you have clarity, focusing the behaviors. So again, if we want to get different results, we need to do things differently. And then the third is the measuring. And we all, again, you guys are all students, and you're students of measurement, and understand the importance of that, again, to see how you're doing, to see where you're making improvements and not. And really, this visual should have arrows, right? Because this is not a one-time process. We're in the 4th quarter. Lots of organizations are guilty of doing an offsite, getting clarity, talking about how to focus behaviors, and then it, you know, kind of peters out by the end of the 1st quarter. So the number one thing, and I think I have a slide towards the end where I'm going to talk about the steps for you to define and implement the culture in your organization. But not surprisingly, the number one thing is that the need for that follow-up, the need for that reinforcement, for putting a process in place that supports the culture once you've identified it. Okay, so let's talk about the first step of how we do this. So Sanjay said, you know, they talked about their mission. You know, what are they all about? You guys, you know, this is not a workshop on creating your strategy or your strategic plan or your business plan. And I use those interchangeably because they really can be in some way. But if you think about how you approach, and I had that earlier slide where we had, you know, the vision off in the distance, what are you working towards? Again, this whole thing of your people getting cynical, you know, if you try to roll out a plan and say, hey guys, here's our 5 values, I've decided, here's the behaviors I want in our culture, now go do that. I mean, you know how people get cynical, and people want to know, where is the organization headed? How does this fit in a broader context of where we're going as an organization? And so ideally, your culture and these things that we're going to identify today, we're going to, by the way, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, we are going to have you discuss your culture in some small group breakouts. Joan's going to play the big man in the sky and move you around into breakout rooms in a little bit. So get ready for that. But you know, ideally, you enter into this culture exercise being able to articulate and say, this is where we're headed as an organization as I look 3 to 5 years out. And Joan, that would even obviously apply also in a university setting. It really applies, you know, to any group of people coming together with a common purpose.
Sure.
One thing I would encourage you guys to do, because I see this with business owners, is not overcomplicate it. You know, and I think sometimes we feel like we have to write this plan it's like writing a term paper in school. Speaking of college, right? Like, you know, I don't know, you get tripped up, like, I don't know how to word it, you know, but people just want to know, where is the organization headed? What's your vision? What do you see happening? And then the mission. And again, that sometimes people think that's esoteric, but it really is key. Why does your organization exist? How do you help people? And if you think about talking about your culture and your values, which should be part of that, that's exactly what you're going to look towards to inform the culture. And then lastly, how do you see that that's going to happen? I was with a company last week. They are in the automotive industry, and they're looking 3 to 5 years out, and 100% of their growth strategies are focused on growing globally. And so, you know, again, the strategies, so each of the things I've got on this slide are really related to 3 to 5 years out. And it's kind of that painting that picture of where you guys are headed as an organization. Okay, so to the extent that you can start with that, I encourage you to do that. If you haven't answered those questions in your organization. So then the next step is to say, okay, if we're looking to get different results, and we know we need some different behaviors, what should those behaviors be? Now, I will stop here and tell you that there are some consultants who help companies define their culture who use a different word than behaviors. I think Sanjay mentioned the code, your culture code. There's a book, Friedman, I think, is the author. He calls them the fundamentals. Some clients of mine have referred to this as their code of conduct. So I'm going to use the word behaviors because I think what I like about the word behaviors is that it's action oriented. And I think it's easy to understand. We for ourselves personally know we have certain behaviors that serve us well and certain behaviors that don't serve us well. And so when we talk about focusing behaviors, what we want to come up with today are some examples of behaviors in your organization that support the culture that you want to create. So this company I was with last week, the CEO said, the number one aspect of our culture is do the right thing. Now, here's the tricky part about that. Do the right thing. How do you know if you're doing the right thing? How do you define that, right? And so that's good. That's a good starting point. Absolutely. But what we need to do is sort of drill down to say, what does that look like in real life? So as you develop your plan, we talked about creating your vision, your mission, and your values. So I'm curious, how many of you, if you could raise your hand, have you identified the values in your organization, your core values. Okay, great. So here's the thing about a value. A value is a principle that governs our actions, right? Honesty, respect. So it's an idea or a concept, and it definitely informs the tone, right, in an organization. But the hard part is that values mean different things to different people. Whereas, again, a behavior is an action. So a behavior is something you can see someone doing. And so it's easier to coach someone on a behavior, provide feedback, measure. Now, the one downside to behavior is, so I'm going to share a parenting example. And so this would be like, oh, yeah, okay, bad behavior. But, I was we were with our younger daughter this past weekend. Yes, we did go to Ohio State. She and her roommates made up their own parents' weekend, which was really fun. We might have broken a few rules around being with other parents, but we were 6 feet away outside. Anyway, I said, when you girls were little, our goal was to have a family where we had mutual respect, and basically to not end up with a couple of brats. And she laughed and she said, wow, okay, I can, she's seeing her peers and maybe where she sees some parents that didn't have that goal. So one of our behaviors was you don't roll your eyes. If you guys think of the equivalent of that in your companies, by the way, when you feel like your employees rolling their eyes at you. So let's think of this from a company perspective. Let's say you want a culture of respect. So what does that look like? What would be an example of a behavior that you would see your employees following or doing that would indicate respect for you, for each other? And if anybody wants to jump in, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you.
Hey, Jeannie, this is Andrew. I think respect is about providing supportive and transparent feedback to people. I think one of the worst things you can do for someone is not give them honest feedback on how they can get better, because you're just really sheltering them from whatever the real issue is, because it maybe makes you feel comfortable not having to confront an issue with them. But when you really respect somebody, you can go to that difficult place and have really good constructive feedback conversations.
Right, exactly. And so the key then, where I would challenge you, if you had that, to say a behavior we expect as part of our culture code or our, how we define our culture, would be how does that happen in a systematic way, right? To ensure a way to be able to measure, is that happening?
Well, I'll throw out actively listening and not interrupting people. Let people know that their opinion has value and worth, and give them the opportunity to voice it.
Right. Yeah, I had noted that one as well, Gary. And Rick, I think you had raised your hand.
I was in agreement, same kind of thing, not talking over people. Some people are very sensitive to that in particular, but letting them express their views.
Yeah. Rob?
One thing from a sales perspective, if you have several people in the room on a call or even on Zoom like we're in today, is not just speaking to what you perceive as the decision maker, but asking other people on the team. And from a company to company standpoint, you're showing them how you respect your own folks and your own culture by saying, Marla or Valerie or Jim, do you have an opinion on this or this topic, and including everybody in the meeting, not just, the person that you feel is the main decision maker.
That's a great point. And I see some folks have made comments here in the chat. So how do you transform employees' beliefs to embrace the necessary behaviors for success? That's a great question. Let's talk about that. Listening actively. Okay. So, okay. So hopefully you guys have your chat box open. So you're seeing there's some good comments coming here. The start, stop, keep exercise. If folks haven't done that, that's a good one. So I think part of the whole point of people having their own beliefs and then therefore feeling that those shape the culture. So as the business owner, I think it's not only your right, but it is your responsibility to say this is the culture of our organization. And I'll give you an example of a client of mine. There were a couple of employees on social media posting and saying negative things about a fellow employee. And the COO said, you know, Jeannie, it was great because I went to our values and to our definition of behaviors, you know, that fit with our culture. And she was able to say, you know, that doesn't fit with our culture of respect and, not obviously doing into others as you'd have them do into you kind of thing. And so it's really, and I'm going to talk at the end about how you go through and do this in your organization. And it certainly is something that you want to collaborate. I typically suggest that you create a task team, and it is driven typically by whoever are your senior leaders, and you might have a top performer that you pull into that. But at the end of the day, it is the business owner who gets to say, like, thank you for your ideas. And of course, you have to be clear about this going into the exercise. But as the business owner, you get to decide and you get to say, this is the culture. Okay, so let's move on because I want to make sure we have time to get to our breakouts. The third step then is thinking about how you're going to measure results. And so back to what you can do in your organization to support those behaviors until they become habits. So, a big part of that is, as we talked before, linking the strategy to these behaviors, right? So that people understand where they fit in a larger context, bringing visibility and communicating what those behaviors are, and then where you can, figuring out metrics to be able to identify whether or not those behaviors are taking place. So what I want to do now is we're going to ask Joan to break us into some small group breakout rooms for discussions. And here's what I want you to talk about in your groups. I'd like you to share some specific behaviors. So think of these as actions, okay, that would make your company amazing if everyone did them on a consistent basis. So it might be show up for meetings prepared. It might be show up to meetings on time. It might be returning phone calls within 48 hours, responding to requests for proposals within, 2 business, but think about when you share these not being, they might start high level, so you might say, we need to have more of a culture of accountability around here. Well, what does that look like, practically speaking? What actions do you expect people to take in order to demonstrate they're being held accountable? Like, for instance, in my process, I expect people to update their monthly scorecards before the meeting and put comments in there, and that behavior shows accountability. So what we'll do, I'm thinking we'll give you guys just about 5 minutes. And so just do some brainstorming. I know Doan's gonna do his best to kind of mix you up. And if one of you wants to jump in and be your small group facilitator just to try to, this is a quick exercise, brainstorming. And if everybody could just try to think of one behavior in their organization that you think needs to be your, a foundation of your culture. Okay, are there questions about the exercise?
No, but I'm going to make just quick announcements, Jeannie, before we go on a breakout.
Go ahead.
Let's see if anybody has any questions for you first on the breakout. If not, I just want to make a couple of acknowledgments. Again, I'm Rob Felber. I'm chair of the EA, and I wanted to wish a very special happy birthday to our executive director, Dawn Winkle. I wanted to thank the members of our programming committee that are here today. I see Rob Gilmore and, of course, Andrew Connors, you heard earlier, and members of our executive team, including Andrew, Brendan Breen in membership, and I apologize if I'm missing anybody else. Before we go into breakouts, November 11th, 4 p.m., we're going to hear the entrepreneurial story behind MCPC with Michael Treblecock Jr. And that really concludes my announcements, and I'll turn it over to, how did you call him the big guy in the sky?
Yeah.
That we might see that on his desk or on his wall.
Be careful what you say. It might become reality.
So I'm going to turn it over to the big guy in a box.
Well, the big guy is Joe Biden. Remember that.
Got to get that in, Bob.
All right, Bob. Okay, I'm going to kick everybody off into some breakouts here. Here we go.
Was everybody able to talk in their small groups and do a little bit of sharing?
That's nice.
Good. Well, I know this is for me as a facilitator, and I'm sure you as a participant, we have such little time today to really dig in to this, but would anybody like to share maybe some specific behaviors that came out of your small group discussion that you thought were like, oh, that might be something I should consider adding into mine?
Well, my personal favorite was the behaviors that I don't see around the Demore Camping Group in the younger partners is any community involvement with civic organizations or trade associations.
Oh, that's a good one, Kath. How about you, Bob Valente? I have a feeling you identified a behavior.
Well, we were talking, Raj and I were kind of talking about this, that there's two things. Number one is what I really enjoy with my employees, because when we talk together, that they would actually be present when we were talking and actually listened to each other to hear what was being said, because that actually created this solution and put everybody on the same page. And Sanjay commented to me that what he found, that follow through is one thing he's trying to work on, because he has to be able to always police to get people to respond back to him. What did you get that done? Did you do this? People have a tendency to be more, I'm not sure if it's myopic or individualistic. They won't report back to you to let you know that the task that they were asked to do is completed. So those are the two things that we talked about.
Okay, that's great. And I see some of the comments in the chat box. So on the slide here, and Dawn, if folks would like the PDF from today's presentation, I'd be happy to provide that to you, and we can distribute that. But
sure.
From a practical standpoint, because I know we're almost out of time, so I spoke to this a little bit before we broke into our small groups, but it really is about just sort of the process that you experienced today, really brainstorming with a group of folks to identify those behaviors, that code of conduct, if you want to call it, or the fundamentals that line up with both where you're taking the organization and what is important to you. Ideally, believe it or not, You know, so you might have 5 values you've identified for your organization. Typically, if you really spend time digging into this and identifying, because think about it, for every value, you know, again, if I say, you know, we need to have a value of respect or a behavior of respect. What are some specific ways that shows up? What are the actions? You might have 3 things, 3 examples of behaviors that you expect people to do that support that. And so typically you're going to end up with between around 12 to as high as a couple dozen of these behaviors that you communicate, you codify into your organization as being defining, you know, there's that dance song, "This is how we do it." And I'm not going to sing, but you know, this is how we do it. So, and you'll see, so once you prioritized, if you're the business owner, you get to decide. If you're the leader, you get to decide, you get input. Then it's really about creating a plan to communicate this throughout the organization. And there's all kinds of ways to reinforce that culture. There needs to be, much like there is when you're creating a business plan, you need the next level of success in your organization is going to require that next level of discipline. And I know a lot of people don't like the word discipline. My creative folks, some of my clients really don't like the word discipline, but it really, culture won't just develop on its own. It needs to be reinforced. There needs to be that constant repeated exposure to what you're saying is important, what your culture is all about, feedback. You know, I encourage my clients in the one-on-ones to talk about those behaviors, certainly, especially if you're not seeing the behaviors that you're looking for from a performance perspective. Make them part of your regular staff or team meetings. You know, you can pick a different cultural behavior each month to focus on, ask people to give specific examples, but it really needs to be a living, breathing part of your planning discussion. And so I recommend at a minimum sort of that monthly meeting rhythm where you're looking at how you're doing, you're talking about that. And I think in some of the comments you guys have been leaving in the chat, it sounds like some of you already have that in place now. So having said that, Doan, I know for our program timing today, we were stopping at 5. I'm not sure if you guys, if you allow time after 5 for Q&A or discussion, or so you tell me.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think if people have some questions, we can do a little Q&A, and then, you know, there's always a little bit of time after to for people to kind of break out and do some networking and saying hi and all that kind of thing. But yeah, if anybody has any questions for Jeanne, thank you, Jeanne, again for spending your time and sharing that with us. I think that's all extremely useful information that we can take and put to work in our workplaces. So does anybody have any questions for Jeanne?
Questions or comments?
Or comments?
I really like the emphasis on action, on behaviors, because I think that's really what drives both culture and strategy. So I really appreciated that.
That's great. Thanks, Jack. Well, and you know, it's interesting because I think the more specific we can be, right, versus being sort of that high level theoretical, people get it better. Keeping it really practical.
Jeanne, is there changes in how you've had to do group dynamics and consulting with regard to additional stresses of what everybody's going through, whether it be, you know, COVID or civil unrest or such? I mean, has that had an impact on how you are opening or introducing content?
Yeah, that's a great point. You know, and I think we've all sort of adapted to doing things like this and meeting virtually, but it certainly has pointed to the need to double down on the pace of communication. In other words, when you're not all together in the office, You know, it's some people do better on their own and in isolation. But the main thing I'm seeing is the need for leaders to really double down on their communication to folks and letting them know what's happening. People are feeling very insecure. And so again, the comment I made at the start of the discussion was that oftentimes when applying stress to a group of people brings out what was not working well before, that was maybe hidden by the fact that revenue was growing. And you know, what's that saying about, you know, good revenue or money money, when money is flowing, it kind of covers or hides, you know, the brokenness sometimes below in the organization. Is there a better way to say that, Andrew?
No, yeah, I've heard that before. Like growth covers all mistakes. When growth hits a speed bump, all the mistakes start coming to the surface.
Right.
Well, Jeannie, you tackled a very complicated topic today about how cultures drive performance. The big question for me, as I was listening to you, is in the old days, you know, like before 2020, people spent more time together to understand their individual cultures and get acquainted. In today's very fast generating kind of an age, and where people are now working at home, and without using, like we did back in the old days with you, using DISC as some kind of indicator of the person, how well do you know your employee to know their thoughts, so you can kind of begin to share with them ways that they can change their behaviors when you achieve a commonality of behaviors together as a company.
Yeah, that's a great point, because how many of you guys have taken a behavioral style like the DISC assessment? Yeah, so, and I still, all my clients, Bob, we have everybody in the organization I have a combination DISC motivators assessment. And that really is key, because you're absolutely right. If you're talking about, you know, one of the behaviors that you're looking for is clear, concise communication. And to Andrew's comment earlier, having the strength of character to give feedback on performance. By the way, I think that's a great behavior to define. If you have a problem with somebody, you have to go to them, you know, so it's making it not a part of your culture that people, you know, talk about people behind their back. And, you know, so if you have an issue with somebody, you got to get them in the room. But if you know, based on somebody's behavioral style, it's not that their behavioral style is an excuse for bad behavior, but when you understand where people are coming from and how their behavioral style, that natural style, might make somebody more, you know, be inclined to be more an effective communicator, more extroverted versus introverted, that I think is a really important part of the culture. And it's interesting, the companies that I work with, one in particular, it's a software company. When they're hiring new people, everybody goes through the assessments, and they really use that as a selling feature to say, we care about getting a good fit for people, for our organization, for culture. And so we do this with everybody. Once they come on, we do some training and one-on-one coaching with them around their assessment. And so they use that as a selling feature about, this is a great place to work. So, which is
Jeannie, do you find a lot of companies use these assessments? Well, they take these assessments, but I often find they're like, oh, I'm a whatever box, you know, I fit into this quadrant, but they never know, like, well, what do I do with this now that I've taken the assessment? It's kind of like it starts and stops pretty quickly, is my experience.
Yep, I agree. That is true. And again, it kind of comes back to this idea of the next level of success requires the next level of discipline. And so, you know, we talked before about changing behaviors. So to me, you know, it's committing to the software company I was referring to earlier. Is about twice a year, they do a refresher training program on the assessments. They maintain a wheel of everybody's behavioral styles and motivators. And so that's a commitment to culture that they've made, right? Because that is an investment of not just money. I mean, in this case, they're having me come in and do that, but at time, you know, taking people away from their desks for a half a day to focus on something that a lot of people might say is sort of touchy-feely or soft, but for them, it's a core part of their culture. So yeah, it's a good point.
Well, thank you again, Jeannie. We really appreciate the time and the expertise. I think there's a lot to unpack here. So you know, I will share a recording, and then also Jeannie, you know, if you want to send a PDF or slides, however you want to send it, I'll sort of share that out to everybody. For those who wanted to stick around, you know, what we typically do is sort of send people off into breakout rooms just to kind of say hi, network, and chat a little bit about, you know, stuff you just talked about or what's going on in your lives, and just make some more human connections via screen time. Before I do that, though, I did want to just mention briefly again, I'm the executive director for the EA. I also lead the entrepreneurship program at John Carroll University, and part of what Rob and I will be doing relatively soon is sending out some updates and sort of some exciting things about reimagining the EA. And then also I will include some things of some projects and initiatives and efforts that are underway at John Carroll that some EA members may want to get involved with, either in volunteering or supporting or giving us some advice or feedback. So there's a lot of stuff kind of in the pipeline. We're trying to put together some good messaging and getting that all out at once. So that'll be coming. But I will kick some folks off into breakout rooms now.
Before you do that, if
please.
you're not an EA member and are interested, you know, please, I don't know, Dawn, if you want to put your email in the chat for everybody real quick. But we welcome that. We do have a fairly built out program schedule, and it continues to grow. As I mentioned, Michael Trellecock Jr. on November 11th. I don't recall the actual December date for Scott Snyder from the Exit Planning Institute, and then Sanjay, who some of you saw on our call, I believe was going to be speaking later in the year from Mace. We have a gentleman from Hostmasters, I believe is going to be our January speaker. So we have a fairly built out and robust and diverse group of companies that are going to be addressing us. And we obviously would prefer to be in person. You know, that might be a cultural goal for summer.
Absolutely. Yeah, I put my stuff in the chat, and again, I'll email everybody, and as we're reimagining some things, we're putting some other processes in place to onboard some folks and deal with sort of membership and all that. So you'll get some communication out about that from me rather quickly. So it's good to see everybody. It's hello to those I haven't met before. I'll get you off into some breakout rooms, do some chatting and networking, and then we'll come back and shuffle things up a little bit.
All right.
All right.